it comes to the Mongols. So that's what's wrong with Russia. Russia is just this. It's England and Japan are the most advanced societies in the world. Japan with the second strongest economy up until last year, and England, the language that took over the world, because it's kind of like I said before, the smartest people taking over, the most desirable land for one, but it's also a place where isn't going to keep getting invaded by, where you just destroy the society over and over again, because they've got that, they're protected by the sea. People have to go across the sea, and then they have to like, climb up the cliffs and beat the force that's waiting for you and all this stuff. And when it does get invaded, it gets invaded by people who know what they're doing, who are organized, who take over and like have a plan on how to keep it, and then they kind of consolidate, and then they can develop this cultural identity, and it basically is a breeding ground for a rule of law, and not just barbarism. So that's what's wrong with Russia, and why England were the ones who took over. But yeah, so the Vikings, they rode down the rivers. There's rivers all over Russia, so they rode their boats through the rivers, and they took over, and it was Vikings. But then the Vikings, over the years became more and more civilized. But around the year 500, that is the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, which was similar to the Islamic Empire in that it was this big empire that was it was just a bunch of like confederated states with one leader who was kind of like, mainly like, I guess, the leader in terms of the guy who would be the boss of the army if they had to go to war, or they paid tribute to him, but he was called the emperor. And he was called the emperor because there was this one guy called, he was the king of the French, who was called Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. And he just kicked ass. He never lost a single battle. He spent his entire reign of like 40 years winning battle after battle after battle after battle. He just won battles. And he won so many battles that he just got this huge empire. Then they all answered to him, and he was a good king. Like he learned to read. He had a tutor, and he learned to read. He was like the first king who ever learned to read. He built churches all over the place. He was a devout Catholic, and he had just great respect for Rome, the Roman civilization. He wanted to recreate it, so he went down to Rome. And he met the Pope, and the Pope said, "You are the new Roman Emperor." He's like, "I'm the new Roman Emperor? Oh, cool. We'll call my empire the Holy Roman Empire." And a little bit to the chagrin of the Byzantines, because they saw themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire. But they were both Christians, so they were like friends. It was the Byzantiums, friends with the Holy Roman Empires, It was kind of the beginnings, 800... a little bit coming out of the Dark Ages from the year 500 up until the year 800 of adjusting to having all these different feudalisms. And then, the first new empire, and the Holy Roman Empire, even though it was started by a French guy speaking French, the capital kind of moved and went into the Germany. It was called the Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic people. It was mainly Germans. And I think the Holy Roman Empire capital was in, don't even know where it was. I don't think it had a capital. It was weird. Like they'd have it, like they would elect an emperor. It was like a electoral monarchy. So it was like, okay, this emperor died. Well, don't give it to his son. We're going to elect who it is. And it's going to be this other king over here in this other kingdom, I think, is how it worked. But it seemed like it worked pretty well. And he was a good leader because he was a great patron of churches. He built churches everywhere, which was actually like kind of like modern day the scholastic people. The people who could read were the monks, and so they would read and they'd make books, and they would also read, collect and read and translate ancient Greek stuff, but they didn't really take it seriously. They thought that they were like devout Christians, and that's the whole problem of the Christian Catholic religion, is they weren't interested in anything else. But that's another video. I think I should have dedicated some video to that. But he did that, and he died, and they had the Holy Roman Empire that lasted all the way up until 1806, so 1,000 years. But still, Rome Europe wasn't anywhere thanks to the see, this is how Islam is superior to Catholicism or Christianity, and that Islam respected all of the Greek literature and scientific method, and cooperation, and there being one God, and don't turn God is God, which is this Allah, which is this great being up in the sky, which is for everybody, and not Jesus. Don't turn Jesus into God, and that's like one of the main thing that, if you read the Quran, that Muhammad stressed and the Muslims stress is, fuck the Trinity. It's not the Trinity. Jesus is not God. Okay, God is God. Jesus is just another prophet, just like Muhammad is another prophet, even though Muhammad's a better prophet than Jesus. But anyways, but the Islamic Empire almost took over Europe, and displaced Christianity and became the new religion, just like Christianity displaced Judaism and became the new great religion. Christianity would have just been another like backwater religion the way Judaism is now, if it hadn't been for a couple of things. They took over the southern half of Spain, and they were actually the first world of Europe. They were the light, literally the light of Europe, because Cordoba, Spain, southern Spain, and Granada had street lights. Like, you'd walk around at night and the streets were swept and clean, and they had street lights everywhere, and nowhere in Europe had paved roads, and they didn't have street lights. People from like France and England and Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, the Christians would come down there to the Muslim lands and be like, whoa, oh my God. So then they come back, and that's when they started building street lights and paving their roads and building churches, and stuff out of stone, and they got the motivation from the Muslims. And there was one English king who was having a civil war, some kind of a war of succession, and he actually sent an envoy down to Cordoba and wanted his protection. Send me an army and I will become Muslim. He wanted to convert, but the guy was like, right. And he didn't help him, and so maybe England would have become Muslim, and then maybe something didn't happen. But the big thing that destroyed the Islamic Empire and Muslims in general, and why they're so backwards these days, they wouldn't be back, Iraq wouldn't be as fucked up as it is now if it wasn't for the frickin' Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, he wanted to take over the whole world. They took over Chile or China, but they respected China. They were more their people. When Genghis Khan and those Muslims and those came over to Islam, it was more foreign to them. They looked different than they did. They're more like white people, and not Chinese, that they're familiar with. The Mongols look like Chinese. They came in, beat them up. They're better warriors, and went into Baghdad and destroyed all their books. Made bonfires of their books. It was like worse than destroying the Library of Alexandria. And then they killed everybody. That was genocide. It was probably the worst genocide, the second worst genocide after the genocide in North America, killing all the Indians, or maybe even worse. I mean, they killed everybody. The way that they did it is they go in and they'd say, you surrender, and if they don't surrender, they go in and they kill everybody, men, women, and children. Then they'd pile up the bones, and then they would have the traders come and spread the word of what they were doing and be like, yeah, you want to become a pile of bones to be replaced by our people, genocide, or do you want to just surrender and pay as much tribute as you can to us? And then so anyways, the leader of the Islamic Empire in Baghdad, he opted to fight, got killed, got taken over, and there was actually a reprogramming of the genetic structure of the Middle East. It was no longer white people. I think the people of the Middle East from back then, from 1,000 years ago, 1,100, were basically like white people, like Greeks, with, Middle Eastern looking people, kind of like how Saddam Hussein looks. But after that, it was like white people and Chinese people. Like if you go down to I haven't been there, but I heard if you go down to the Middle East, like in Iran and Iraq and stuff, you're going to see a lot of Ching-Chang looking people running around. And it's because, those are the Mongols that came over and they took over. And, I think they made the blood swarthier with their Mongolic blood. I bet you Saddam Hussein has some Genghis Khan in him. They say 1 out of every 200 people on the entire planet is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. because he's fucked a lot of people, fucked a lot of women. And his people, his children, took over and killed everybody and took over the world, literally, the entire world. And so, yeah, they burnt all the books. And so within a course of a few years, Persia, the Persian empires of the 1300s was a bunch of illiterate, violent people of Mongolian Turkic blood, whereas 100 years before that, it was actually people who were the most advanced, enlightened people in the world. And so it hadn't been for that, and then also there was the Spanish Inquisition of the year 491, where they all got kicked out of Spain and basically murdered, killed. Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 came and I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Spanish Inquisition. They wanted to take over Spain. Spain was a bunch of feudalisms, a bunch of different kingdoms. They had Leon, Galicia, Portugal, Aquitaine, Cordoba, Granada, and they were like they borrowed. There were a bunch of Jews there, and they borrowed a bunch of money. They were from Castile, which I think modern day Madrid, I guess. And there's Catalan on the east, but they borrowed a bunch of money from the Jews to kill all the Muslims, kick them out, make them basically wipe out anything Muslim, to the point where most Spaniards now don't know anything about Islam. And then instead of paying the Jews back, they didn't pay them back at all. They just kicked them out, and so they all had to move to Ireland and Scotland. And then the Pope was even like, "You guys are way too barbaric. What are you doing?" So they had a fight with the Pope, a naval battle off the coast of Italy, and they kicked the Pope's ass. And then they had all this money, and that's when they sent Christopher Columbus to America and destroyed America, took over the Aztecs and destroyed them, and took over the Incas and destroyed them, and took over South America. That's why South America is so fucked up. It's just kind of like bad legacy from them. And that's why Spain is fucked up. It's probably one of the most fucked up countries in Europe. Even though economically they're okay, but they had a huge three-year civil war in the 30s, which was horrific and appalling. And I went there. I didn't really like them, but that's another story. Yeah, I don't want to talk trash about people. But there are some cool things about the Islamic Empire that exist in Spain. Like the flamenco comes from Islam, the dance and stuff. It's similar to the Rolling Dervish. It's been around But anyways, the Mongols took over and basically turned Islam. They accepted their religion, but they turned Islam from a religion of being interested in antiquity to like a bunch of fundamentalist freakos, from killing them all. And luckily, right before that happened, the Europeans snatched up the stuff that the Islamics had learned in the Crusades. The Crusades, back in the days of Charlemagne, the beginnings of the Holy Roman Empire, Europe was actually the hillbilly retards, and it was the Middle Easterners and Iraqis who were the smart people of First World. Those Europeans came down. They didn't shower, which I can understand because it's cold up there, but they didn't shower. They couldn't read as much. They didn't know anything. They came in and they were going to kill all those Muslims because they weren't the Christians. They weren't the true. And so they went in there and they built a whole bunch of like really good fortresses, really good castles, Crusader castles, and they even had a kingdom called the Kingdom of Jerusalem for 100 years until they finally got killed. But beaten by the Islams. But the Islamics were really I think they improved. The French, mainly the French, who were the ones who did the Crusades, the Franks. That's what they were called by the Muslims. Came back better people because of the Muslims that they met, not because they visited the Holy Land, but because they learned stuff they learned how to be civilized from Muslims when they went down there. They went down there to hack, maim, kill, and take no prisoners. But when they got killed, they got beaten by Saladin. I think that was his name. He let them all go. He didn't kill him at all because that's what Muhammad did. When Muhammad went and killed people and took people, he didn't kill anybody. He had the compassion, and then that's what actually what the Persians did a lot, and they probably remembered that. But that's also what the Ottomans did. And so he wanted to do that, and Saladin, he just let them all go. He's like, get out of here, go back to Europe. So he just let him go. I think he even gave him food and stuff and let him go. And that was the end of the Jerusalem kingdom. But they went back and they learned a lot of stuff. That's when they brought I think that's when they brought Arabic numerals, which replaced Roman numerals, so they could do better math and make engineering and stuff. That's when they learned about science. That's when they learned about that was kind of sowing the seeds to the Enlightenment. They brought back utensils, I think, and just silks, and just it was more trade, and they kind of had respect for that. And then a couple hundred years later, they got taken over by the Mongols. But the Mongols also wreaked havoc in Europe. I mean, they basically took over Russia. They kicked the descendants of the Vikings' asses, and they destroyed like the Poles, for example. Who are the best warriors? Well, you had the knights, chivalry, the knights with those guys in the shining armor on the horses and the jousts. Well, that's really good as far as enforcing. See, the knights of Europe are kind of similar, the counterpart to the samurais of Japan. Those are the guys who are hired by these little fiefdom kingdom guys living in the castle on top of the hill to go around and collect taxes from your peasants within a 50-mile radius of wherever you live, 100-mile radius of a little kingdom. And so he'd go around and he, one of those knights on a horse could fight off 7 people at a time, because all they had was pitchforks, and they couldn't stab them. You'd have to stab them in a good place, and because they had all that armor on and the chainmail, and you'd whack them with a stick, and the chainmail would protect you. But as far as like a bunch of like warriors running around on horses and having a pitched battle, those knights weren't as good of warriors as the Mongols, who didn't have any armor at all. They could go a lot faster. Their bows, they could shoot their arrows twice as far as a crossbow. The crossbow is the most powerful missile projectile of the Middle Ages. It could shoot an arrow a quarter of a mile. Oh wow, so far, a quarter of a mile. You had to crank it up. You could only shoot like 1 a minute. The Mongols could shoot 6 arrows a minute, because they had the regular bow and arrow. Only they could shoot it twice as far as a crossbow. They could shoot it a half mile, 800 yards. They could shoot it. Those things were chainmail piercing arrows. Chainmail shirt was 60 pounds. Okay, so you're basically wearing something around you that weighs 60 pounds, is really uncomfortable and pinching you and hurting you. That's completely useless. It's going to get pierced by a Mongolian arrow. The Mongols were the perfect war machine. They had hundreds of thousands of guys who would convene for one purpose, and that's to kill you and kill everything about you. And that's what they did with Russia. They didn't kill everybody up there, though, and take over. What they did is they would go and destroy your army, and then they would come back and exact tribute from you, and then they go off into their tent cities again, and then they come back and get their tribute from you, and they did that for hundreds of years. That's why they were called the Golden Horde. After the Mongol Empire broke up, it broke up into the Ilkhanate down in the Middle East, the Golden Horde, the Blue Horde, the White Horde. They're called the Golden Horde because they were so rich in gold. They just bring the gold back to their tent city and have a big pile of gold. Oh, what are we going to do now? I don't know. Because they were just fighters. That's all they did. They didn't know how to read. They didn't know how to... See, that's why they fucked up the Islamic Empire. They didn't know how to read. They didn't have any respect for any of that. All they cared about was fighting. That's all they did. They ate... They were animals. They ate... Whenever a horse would give birth to a mare, that was like dinner for them. They would eat the placenta, drink all the blood, They'd be like surrounded by lice, and they just eat the lice and scrap the scabs and eat the scabs, and they're dirty. And they would kill a reindeer, and they would just tear all the flesh off the reindeer and strap it over their horse, and then they would like sit on the actual meat and ride the meat, and they would like tenderize it with their bodies bouncing up and down on the meat, and then rip it off and eat it. And all they cared about was killing. And because there was a mission from God that Genghis Khan was like evil. I mean, if you want to talk about evil aliens, you could talk about the evil aliens mutating the minds of the Mongols and turning Genghis Khan. Actually, there is one. The aliens, the Venusians, say that Genghis Khan currently is in the evil empire, the evil alien empire of the Orions, and he's working as a clerk, a shipping clerk. So, anyways, they had a battle with the Poles. I don't know which battle it was called, but it was like 30,000 Poles died because they couldn't fight. The Mongols hacked them. The knights, right? The cream of the crop. Poles got together. Polish kingdom fought them in like 1200 or something. Polish-Lithuanian Empire got their asses handed to them. They won all the battles in the Middle East. They won all the battles in Hungary. They took over Hungary. And they're about to take over the rest of Europe, and they probably could have. But then their great Khan from like Mongolia died, and they had to go back to Mongolia to find out what to do next, and like what to do, and they never came back to Europe because I guess that's when the Solidarity broke up. But yeah, they were better warriors. They could run around faster, and the women fought too. Like they were just one big warring war machine. They didn't have, they didn't leave the women back. Like in Europe, the women probably stayed back and didn't help fight. If they did help fight and were knights. And the way that the Mongols fought was very conducive to women's bodies, because women could run around faster because they're lighter. Their horses could go faster, and they could shoot just as many arrows and just as accurately. They just had smaller bows and smaller arrows, but they could shoot probably just as fast. And there were probably one-on-one battles between women and knights where the Mongol woman would actually win, because, the knight's like, well, where'd you go? My horse is so slow in my big knight outfit. Ow, that hurts. The arrow just went into my heart from my chainmail, so that's the Mongols. And then the Mongols did something that really fucked everybody up. They were so dirty and nasty that they Pestis bulbobius, or whatever it was called, the Black Plague, they invented. They invented the Black Plague somewhere in China from being so nasty and dirty and skanky, and then they brought it over to Europe. They were up on the Crimean, on the north side of the Black Sea, and they were besieging a town up there, modern day Ukraine. And a bunch of those Mongolians were dying of something, and so they were like, "Oh, well, let's catapult a bunch of our dead Mongols into their city." That was the Black Plague that they catapulted into that city. And I think everybody in the city died, and some of the people escaped who were like Venusian, because this is the kingdom of Venice was in full swing back then. The Venusians escaped, came over, and some of those Pestilus bulbosiuses were inside of fleas that were living inside of rats. And see, this was in a time of actually burgeoning, growing population of Europeans. Europe was doing quite well in the 1300s. The Black Plague struck Europe in 1347 and struck Italy in 1347. The Black Plague was killing everybody, though. They killed I think they killed 20 million people in China. The Black Plague did. The Black Plague. And so people had heard about the Black Plague. They were like, there's this plague, killed all the people in China. The plague killed a bunch of people in Ukraine. Oh yeah, the plague's in Italy now. It hit everywhere. It got England. And they were like, oh shit, it's coming our way. We're going to die. Some of the urban cities lost more than half of the people. I think some of the urban cities in Italy lost like 75% of the people. I think it killed the Germans the least, only 30%, but it killed everybody. In the Middle East, it killed them. So right after the Mongols wreak havoc, the Black Plague wreaks havoc. It came and, it got into Italy. And I guess what happened was, but Europe had a very high population of people. They were doing well. It was after the Crusades. They had brought that information back from the Crusades. They're starting to get interested in Maybe new techniques and new civilization. They're cooperating and trading, and there's lots of people. Only it was kind of like an early industrial revolution. When the industrial revolution happened, there was so much population in the cities that it became very congested, and they had lots of plagues. For example, in London, in the height of the industrial revolution, it got so crowded with people that if you threw a rock into the Thames River, it wouldn't sink. It would just kind of float there for a little bit before it sank, because it was a fucking sewage system. There was human feces so thick that everybody was dying of plague over there, and it was kind of the same thing. There was too much population, and there was also like lots of urban people living in squalor, like really poor people. Like there was actually slavery in Europe at that time called serfdom, where you were tied to your land. You legally could not leave your land. You could not leave your land in Europe. You had to get permission from your lord, and I think the lords were actually abusing people. They were exacting too much toll. This is like in early 1300s. Robin Hood lived in the 1200s, the 1250s. So it's kind of like 100 years before that, where Robin Hood lived, and because rich people taking over, abusing the poor people. Rob from the rich, steal from the poor. Robin Hood was rebelling against Bad King John. Bad King John was like he was the brother of Richard the Lionheart, who was famous from his crusades. Came back from the crusades and was besieging a city in France, and then he got shot by an arrow and died from that. And then his brother inherited the throne. I think that was the Angevin Empire, the remnants of the French when the French took over England. I guess I'll talk about that a little bit. The French took over England. England was taken over by England gets taken over and over again by people. So they get the best of everything. They get, these people, and then they get these people, and then, so England, was originally taken over by the Romans, so they got the Roman civilization, but they still maintained the native roots from the Scots, who was never taken over by the Romans. And then the Vikings came over and took over basically all of England. The only people English who were left over were the ones who weren't really consolidated with anybody else, kind of like outlying kingdoms, the Gauls or the Gaelics in, Wales and stuff. But, the kingdom of York, which was originally called Jarvik, which was like a Norwegian word, was a Viking kingdom, I think Northumbria, and Scotland and stuff. And then in the year 1066, more Vikings come over. Only these Vikings were like long lost descendants of Vikings, so they were speaking French. They were French-speaking Vikings. Took over England because I think what happened was in 1066 is when they did it. This guy called William the Conqueror. I don't think he was even a king of France. He was like a duke of France. He was a bastard king. What happened was the king of England came over and I guess got captured by the Duke of France, William the Conqueror, and he got captured by him, and they kind of became friends, but and they went hunting and stuff and whatever, hung out for a year or two. But I guess William the Conqueror said, look, if I'm going to let you go, you have to make me king, your successor king. And he was like, okay, just let me go. So he let him go. So then the king died, and then he was like, oh, he died, so I get to be king now. So he invaded England, saying that he was going to be the next king. And so he fought the guy, and he beat him in the Battle of Hastings, I think it was called. And, it was kind of a close battle, but, the king wasn't a popular king, could consolidate his people, and got taken over by this, this good warlord dude who took over England. And so for 300 years, the rich people spoke French and the poor people spoke English. And that's why one of the reasons English had so many words for the same thing. Poultry, pollo is the word for chicken in Spanish, and it's like polo or something in French. Poultry is like cooked chicken. And then chicken is just the little thing running around, because the poor people had to capture it and cut it up and cook it for the rich people, who would call it the poultry, right? Yeah, same thing for like all sorts of stuff. So, yeah, it's interesting. But for a long time they spoke the French, and then they could only speak French, and then they could mainly speak French, and then English was their main language, but French was their secondary language, and then French and English kind of melted, and then it kind of changed English and turned English more into a bastardized language, which is present English words now are half Germanic and half Romance, mainly because of the Normans who came over there, but also because of the Romans before then. But and then the Germanic part is from all of those Vikings that came over after the Romans left and during the Viking ages, with only place names coming from native Gaelic and Britannic. But they came over and it turned into the Angevin Empire because he kept his lands in France, so they had the Angevin Empire. And but then they had Bad King John, and he was just he exercised his power by just threats and stuff. And I think he eventually I think he died of natural causes, but he was the end of that dynasty, I think. But he was the guy who was the king during Robin Hood. And then I think his grandson, his name was William Longshanks, and he was the guy who fought against Braveheart, because that's when the Scots didn't want anything else to do with England, and they got their independence there for a couple of years, up until 1707 when they created Great Britain. But that's England. Okay, I guess back to the Mongols, right? The Mongols take over. They kicked ass. They kicked the Poles' asses. And but they also took over Russia. But more of like a parasite, like tent people. But they did have an empire that was actually bigger than the empire of the Islamic Empire in terms of square miles, because they were such a consolidated group of horse riders from all over the place who were badasses. Oh, the Black Plague, though. Yeah, they created the Black Plague. And there was all these... but anyway, yeah, they had slavery in Europe back then in those days. Serfdom, which is basically slavery. People didn't own anything. They just worked the land for as much. They worked the land 6 days a week, and then they could work their own little backyard like the seventh day, and give everything they owned to their lord, who didn't pay them anything, and so they couldn't do anything. They just worked all day long, and that's what they did. They couldn't travel, they couldn't leave their land, and nothing. And so that probably, there was lots of people living very poorly, so dirtily, which made it easy for the Black Plague to come and kill people, because a lot of those little pestilences, those little fleas could fly around and live in the rats, and lots of rats, and it just killed everybody. It killed like half the people, and when a household would somebody in the household would get the Black Plague, they would just have to lock everybody in the household in. There was quarantine, and so everybody would die. And so at the end of the Black Plague, Europe lost I guess half of its population. So after 3 years, 5 years ago we had so many people. Now we have all these empty houses, all these empty cities. It's like a ghost town, just a bunch of goats running around and dog packs running around and empty houses, and so the people who were left over were kind of like the bumpkins way out in the middle of nowhere, who were so far away that they didn't get it. And so they were uncivilized and coming in and moving into empty houses and just getting drunk and acting crazy and kind of causing anarchy and problems. But after that, they kind of, the Lord, wanted people to work their land, but there weren't any people to work the land, so they kind of could just go to the highest bidder, and that was the end of serfdom. And serfdom never came back. They realized that it was better for poor people to be able to move around if they wanted to, I want to move over here, I want to save up and go on vacation over here and then live there for a little bit and move over here, rather than being like, you can't leave. You're not allowed to leave. So, but anyways, that's why this knight was doing the knight thing, because they were, they were dressed up like that, and they'll just hack your head off if you don't pay the Lord this much money. So they were knights weren't, But then they kind of abused that, and that's where chivalry came in, where there was actually, let's create a rule of law for these knights. Don't rape women, It was kind of like Confucianism for Europe, which the chivalric code. Be honorable, don't, chivalry, the age of chivalry, from 800 until about 1400. So I guess, yeah, they got better, but things really got better for Europe after the Black Plague in 1347 to 1350. But serfdom existed in Russia all the way up until like 1870 or something like that. Because Russia, had that whole legacy of just, whatever goes. This is Sylvia's Russia. Whatever goes, goes. The Mongols took over and they became the Golden Horde, and then so then their kingdom, the Tsars, was kind of running off of that model, like of just do whatever you can get away with. Yeah, I mean, Russia has a pretty crazy history, like Ivan the Terrible was basically would just kill people, and go around and, and I guess that's what the people needed, I guess at one point he abdicated to become a monk because he was like, I'm sick of killing people. So then they had civil wars and they were like, okay, you can come back. But he was like, I'm only coming back if I get to do whatever I want, if I'm an absolute ruler. So they're like, okay. So he came back, absolute ruler, kept killing people. Yeah, man, it was just coup after coup. I think there was this one lady who cooed some guy, and then in Russia, they got this one guy. See, in Europe, they a lot of the royal families were like relatives with each other. It was I think it was a way to ensure good trade, because there wasn't, they were the only people who were literate. The normal peasant people weren't literate, and only the church people were literate and the royal family. So if they were going to do like trade with each other and figure out where the borders are, so that I get the taxes from these guys and you get the taxes from the guys on the other side of the river, and don't let our serfs, don't let them move around. And that's kind of how modern day languages are so distinct. I mean, you cross the freaking Rhine and they're speaking another language all of a sudden. Well, it's because of serfdom. People couldn't move around. They just spoke the same language, and they only moved within your own country. And yeah. So, anyways, but there was one class of people, right? The royal class, and they moved all over the place, and they could speak all the different languages, and they were actually related. I mean, I don't have that many examples right now, but I mean the King of England's sister was like the Queen of Bohemia. I mean, whenever you get married, it's like, who's the prince going to marry? The princess of what country, basically, Most of the time, you're not going to marry somebody from your own country. You're going to marry somebody from another country. And so, yeah. I mean, Tsar Ivan the Terrible tried to marry one of Queen Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting. And, Henry VIII married the daughter of the King of France, the King of Isabella. Remember Isabella and Ferdinand, who did the Spanish Inquisition? Well, her daughter married King Henry III, I think. His first wife. Anyways, yeah. So they were going to try and get the new king of Russia. And so the nearest line to the throne wasn't even Russian. He was a German dude. So he got some German guy, but he didn't like Russia. He liked Germany. It was Peter something or other. And so then they were going to get a wife for him. So they didn't get a Russian wife. They got a German woman, a German girl, like a 15-year-old German girl from like a poor aristocratic family, but she came from an aristocratic family, so they brought her over to marry him. They didn't get along. But he was kind of an asshole or an idiot. He wished he was German, so he tried to pretend that he was a German king in control of Germany, even though it was Russia. So he didn't speak their language. He didn't want to learn their language. He was just like, he made all of the Russian soldiers dress like Germans, changed the color, which I think Russia was like red, and they made them all change into blue, just like the Germans. And then he made all of the Russian Orthodox priests not dress in Russian, but he made them dress like German priests. And then he tried to attack the part of Germany he came from to annex it into Russia, so that maybe, I mean, who knows? Maybe he would have even moved the capital from Moscow all the way over to, or from St. Petersburg, maybe is where it was. I don't know. Moscow all the way over to freaking Germany. You know. Okay, now I'm finally Germany. Anyway, his wife was smarter, and I guess he was an idiot. He was like, instead of arguing with somebody, he would just be like, yeah, boo boo. I just won the argument, you know. And he would like, he'd have war games with like little like toy soldiers, and he'd make his like wife play the war games and make his wife like march around like a soldier in his room and stuff. And once she came home and he was hanging a rat, and he's like, yeah, because he committed treason, ha. And so, anyways, a lot of the Russians didn't like him, and she didn't like him either. And one day he was like, he was about to invade another place or something, and he was like, toast to my invasion, and she didn't toast. She didn't raise her glass. So he was like, oh my God, I'm gonna get rid of you as soon as I'm king, because his mother was still the queen, and I think he usurped somebody. Or his aunt or something was the queen. He's like, as soon as I'm king, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to get rid of you and maybe even kill you. You're over. And so, anyways, she had been making friends with all of like the guys around him. So she got them to coup him, to just barge in. You know, it was like his office guard, go in, barge in, and drag him off and kill him. But they said that he died of like diarrhea. That's what they said he died of. I guess to embarrass him, man, posthumously or something. But anyways, she became the Tsarina, and she ended up being Catherine the Great. And she was reigned over a really successful period of Russia. I think she grew the empire by like 50 square kilometers a day or something. I mean, she like added a whole lot of terrain to it. Because she appointed a whole bunch of really good people under her command, really good like war generals and stuff, and she modernized the area, Russia. She brought kind of the Renaissance to the land, put up a lot of classic art around the palace and stuff like this, and Russianized it, kind of brought Russia up to the levels. But still, Russia was still kind of like Mongolianish, Tatars. They had like these big beards and kind of dressed like Rasputin, and they were like, and let's see what happened. And then they had Peter the Great, and he was the guy who really turned in Russia into a good force. He was the one who made them all cut their beards. He did a big tour through Europe, check out Europe and see how Europe was. Only he was like a major, Russia, we are Russians. They went and just trashed every place they went to, bashed out the windows, pissed all over the floors, and were like left, and we're like, ha. And he traveled with like a huge band of people, like a bunch of midgets, a whole troop of midgets went with him, and like all kinds of people. And anyways, he went back to Russia at the end of it and was like, oh man, Russia's backwards. So he made them all shave their beards. He made them all. He built a whole bunch of ships, and he learned how to build ships himself. I guess he was 6'7", so he was like really like, imposing guy, and they all knew who he was because he was Mr. Tall Guy. But when he traveled around, he dressed like the sailors, and he wanted them to call him captain instead of czar and stuff. And he was, I guess, early 1700s, but or early 1800s, because I think before him was Catherine the Great, and she actually saw, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI get beheaded. But he went and had a big war with Sweden. Some like despotic Swedish warrior was wreaking havoc the height of the Swedish Empire, and they got his ass kicked by him. And so he went back and modernized his army, and got the new kind of industrialized kind of stuff going. And then he went back and had another war when Sweden tried to invade him again after he rebuilt St. Petersburg. I think he even actually helped himself build St. Petersburg, but Yeah, he defeated the Swedes that time, and so then Russia like owned, like was like now the power of northeastern Europe for the first time, and then they took over like the Black Sea area. They got their warm water port. I don't know if they have a warm water port. I don't think they do. I think they only have St. Petersburg. Well, I guess it's kind of doesn't get frozen over, but yeah. And then they, I think it was he who defeated Napoleon in 1806 when he tried doing, but then they had another war after Napoleon, or maybe it was before Napoleon. They had a war with Europe, and they got their asses kicked because Europe had the railroads and they didn't, and Europe had like iron cannons and everything, and they didn't have all that kind of stuff. So, anyways, but then they won a war after that. But yeah, so it was kind of like the beginnings of like industrial revolution. It was kind of like, when was the industrial revolution? 1840 to 1910 or something like that. I guess that was before that. But yeah, that was after the French Revolution, which was a big turning point in European history, because that's kind of when the common man started to come up in Europe, had more of say, because they had the. Well, let's see. Let's start talking about the development of Europe. The development of Europe happened first when serfdom went away after the Black Death, and then serfdom went away. You know, some people started to have, in the later half of the 1300s, people had more power, more say, and that's when the Catholic Church first started to lose power, because. I guess the Catholic Church was kind of like involved with the aristocracy and telling people what they can and can't do, can and can't say, and and then there was this other religion called the Flagellants who came and kind of were threatening the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church didn't have the magical powers to make the Black Death go away. So then the Flagellants are like, well, we can do it. See, look, we're whipping ourselves. It's our sin that we got the Black Death. Our fault. Become a flagellant. Flagellants have magical powers. A flagellant made a cow talk. I guess a cow talked because a flagellant was there, and like they could like bring babies back to life and stuff. But anyways, that went away. But that was kind of the beginnings of the end of the Catholic Church superpower. I think Catholic Church superpower was kind of there because people were kind of trying to bring back the Roman civilization, and they wanted to center it around Rome. That was like the symbol, and so they wanted like their guy there to kind of be the mediator for everything from Rome, and they used Christianity as the excuse. Christianity, our God, Zeus became Jesus. Our God, Jesus, and his representative is the Pope, and he tells everybody what to do, but then they were abusing their powers, and they had the Reformation. Martin Luther. When was Martin Luther? Was he like the 1600s? So I guess he was after King Henry. The first Reformation, beginning of Protestantism, happened with King Henry VIII, which was in like 15. He was king from 1506 to like 1542 or something like that, 1552. But a lot of people are like, oh yeah, King Henry VIII started the Protestant religion because he wanted to divorce that Spanish queen and marry Anne Boleyn. That's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, but they had been pissed off at the Catholic Church before that, and the Pope saying you can't divorce her and marry her was basically just another reason why they didn't like the Catholic Church. He thought he had more power than he was entitled to, more power than he deserved. Even though the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was on the same side as the church, of the Pope, and the French were and all this stuff. The English didn't see it that way, and it does make sense. I mean, they were selling entrance into heaven for like exorbitant fees. That's how they paid for the St. Peter's Cathedral in like the early 1500s, by selling passages into heaven, and it was just basically aristocracy. Those monks were the aristocracy, and all they cared about was keeping power. I mean, if they didn't, when the printing press was invented, they would have been helping with the printing press and spreading Bibles, but they fought against the invention of the printing press. They didn't like the printing press, the Catholics. They didn't want to spread the Bible around. You're literally not allowed to read the Bible. In fact, Catholics, modern day Catholics, are not allowed to read the Bible in nunneries. I saw a YouTube video. I heard the woman say it herself. She turned into a Muslim after that. And they were totally corrupt. I mean, they did a survey before King Henry VIII made his decision to break from the Catholic Church and become the head of the church himself of England. Of all the Catholic places around England, the monasteries and stuff, and out of like 380 monasteries that 380 like Catholic leaders, bishops or whatever they call them, only like 80 or something, only like 30 or something like that. Like a vast minority could even recite the Ten Commandments. They didn't know, they didn't know like how many chapters were in the Bible. They didn't know anything. They were completely illiterate about religion. It wasn't about the Bible. I mean, they had the Bible, but it wasn't about that. It was about whatever the Pope said you could do about this, that, and the next thing. That was it. So they were asking for it. So then he was like, all right, I can't divorce her. Well, okay, I'm going to divorce her anyway. He got excommunicated, whatever, And that's that. And then after that, the Germans decided they were going to think for themselves and broke off and started their own religion, Lutheranism and then Calvinism. And even though there was a lot of stuff, like Martin Luther didn't like the Jews. He thought Jews were evil. But he did, have those 99 theses of like, trying to curb the power of the Pope and those guys and bring it more power to the poorer people of the upper classes. Kind of like the Magna Carta. I think it was Bad King John, the one who I was talking about before, who was the guy who signed the Magna Carta, which was basically the first limiting of the power of. It was the transfer from absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, where the king has to actually get permission from the parliament or all of the rich dukes around the area in order to like get money to invade somebody or to do this kind of thing. Because before that, absolute power, they were always invading each other. I mean, they'd have wars about anything, dude. They'd have wars because some guy was pissed off that this guy had that land 100 years ago, so he wanted to go take it back. So he'd get his old people together and fight him and kill him. They'd have wars because he thought that, one guy thought that he had more of a right to be the king of the kingdom than the other guy, so they'd have a big civil war. And it was just war of egos for the leaders, It wasn't, if you study wars, there were wars every couple of years, there were wars all the time. It was crazy. So, anyways, yeah. But, consolidation of power is definitely a good thing if you've got somebody who knows what they're doing, and not somebody who's doing it just to like, just to make himself rich and build shit, just to build shit, For example, Louis XIV back in the early 1700s, or about 1650s-ish, made France the greatest country in Europe because he consolidated his power. France was kind of like a fiefdoms of different places, and where it was a country, but it wasn't like where the king had all this power. But he built Versailles, the big palace. He moved it from Paris down 13 miles south of Paris and built Versailles, which had like 160 palace rooms or something like that, and made all of his like dukes, all of his surrounding feudal like vassals move into Versailles and live with him so he could keep an eye on him all the time. and so then had control over everything and became very rich. But he used his money for good things. You know, he built like, I think it was he who built the canal all the way across France, so that big ships could go from England to the Mediterranean without having to bypass the Strait of Gibraltar, which at the time was controlled by the Spanish. You know, so he didn't have to pay them anything and didn't have to. You know, they built that, and then. But then, you know, it turned into that all of that great power that France, you know, like French became. That's why they call it the lingua franca. France was the number one language of Europe. You know, it supplanted Latin back in the 1670s or something as the number one language of the elite, where people would all get together and they'd speak French instead of Latin for the first time. And it was the first language of the world up until, because they had a big empire up until World War One, when English took over. But they, he had that. But then, you know, when he died, the next guy had all this power and was really rich, and then it just turned into this opulence that the royal family had. Was just, the royal family was just ridiculously rich, and they were just rich, and then they just, you know, out of touch with freaking people. They were just like, they get their money and they just live their life. And so that's why King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded. What happened with them was, there was these like potato famines and everybody was dying because there were like, for 3 years in a row there was this really bad winter, and so there was a really bad economy. And even though there was a bad economy, he didn't really notice it because he was out of touch. And then he would spend all this money on the American Revolutionary War, just because he didn't like the English. You know, he'd send all these troops to help the Americans fight them, which spent a lot of money. And then he just wasn't a leader. Like, he would just do whatever like the guy